Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 98. Yes, we are crawling tooth and nail towards our penultimate 100th episode. You're going to want to be there for that. With our book today, written by an author who went to his grave defying modernity, postmodern fame culture, and the internet and social media. This book was penned by a writer who, if he were alive and writing today in his 30s, you probably wouldn't have heard of him because his choices and posture defied the algorithm that runs so much of our buying and creating behavior. The author who, much like his contemporaries Tom Wolfe and Nora Ephron, marched to the beat of his own drummer. Today, we will be summarizing, we will be talking about the ins and outs of Charles Portis's True Grit. Now, we will be joined on this march into the literary wilderness at the open of our month of March with our returning guest host from episode number 52, when we cover The Way of the Samurai by Inazo Tobi, John Hill, aka Small Mountain. How you doing, John?
Dude, I am so ready for this conversation. Congrats, honestly, on getting to 100, first of all, because we need to talk about that. Like, most people don't do 10 of these kinds of things before they bail. So 98, significant achievement, my friend. Well done.
Well, it's one of those things where I always had the vision in my head for this show. I always thought, okay, if I could do 5 years worth of episodes, that's a corpus, that's a thing. And I can do anything for 5 years, even if no one listens to it. Even if I only have like 1,000 listeners, it doesn't matter because I did 5 years of something. And then I can notch that belt. And it's way more than that. But, I can notch that belt and I can move on with the rest of my life. And it's like, for me, it's like writing a book or cooking a meal, right? It's something that's going to take time. It's going to flow over the course of time. And I'll be honest, there are days when I get up and I come to this microphone and I'm like, I don't want to do this today. But then I get to talk to awesome people like you and our other guests who have been on. And about halfway in, I'm like, oh, no, this is fine. Actually, I'm usually about 10 minutes in. I'm like, oh, this is fine. This is going to be interesting. Or I'll get a guest. And again, all of our guests have been great. Occasionally you will get a guest or you'll get a guest host like our guest host, Tom Libby, who's now our almost semi-regular co-host, or actually not semi-regular. He's our regular co-host now. You'll get Tom on and we'll be talking about a book before we hit the record button. And he'll say something to me like, I don't know how we're going to get anything out of this book. And then at the end of the recording, at the end of an hour and a half long conversation, or at the end of a 2 hour long conversation, he'll look at me at the end of the recording and he'll say, okay, I saw it.
So, okay, I have a hard question as someone who makes a lot of content, and I've also struggled with some of that stuff myself of like, is this worth doing?
Yeah.
Do you think that is your superpower, is being able to like pull stuff out of people to make the conversation great? Do you think that that's what makes him a great co-host for you? How do you split that in your head?
I think that, like most things in the content creation business, and you and I were talking a little bit about this before we hit record. People are always looking for the hack or the shortcut or the thing that will, and this is why we're going to cover True Grit today, the thing that will make the algorithm like them. And I've never cared about any of that nonsense. I don't really care if the algorithm likes me or not. I don't really care if I get 10,000 likes on a platform. Would I like to get that? For sure. I'd be crazy to say no, that I don't want that, or I
Yes.
don't want that for the show. But I'm going to keep doing this regardless of what the algorithm says. I'm going to keep doing this, quite frankly, if I get no feedback from it, or if I get a lot of feedback from it, or if I get a little bit of feedback from it, because I believe in the show. I believe in the value of what we're doing here. And so I think that's my superpower. I also think that on and this is the dark side of that. The dark side of this is sometimes it could be a little bit self-indulgent. So you gotta have to like watch out for that. And there have been some episodes that I've done where I did step back a little bit and I was like, well, I could have pulled some more out of that for other people versus that just being, kind of, oh, I'm gonna do this for myself and it'll be fine. Um, but I'm constantly going into the books looking for what can I give our listeners? What can I give a person who 10 years from now might pick up this in a search for a particular book? This will pop up on Google. They'll be like, oh, I didn't know what that is. Click, and they'll listen to it and they'll go, oh, I didn't know that this particular insight could be pulled from this book. That's the game I'm playing. So
I love that. And I think that the order of operations there is the important part, right? You said would I like to have those kind of results? Yes, but you're not making your content purposefully to go try to capture those results because the work itself is worth doing in the way that you're doing it.
Plus, I think that I was actually going to post this on Facebook today, and then I decided not to. But it is an insight that I think is worthwhile and probably should have more traction or more popularity. But it is this idea that these large language algorithms that we're using to aggregate all of the teratrillions of information that we have put on the internet in the last 40 years in the Western world anyway, those algorithms are going to expose who's real and who's fake.
1,000%. 100%.
And the people who are real, and I mean genuine people who are genuinely real, and we already saw this a little bit with Google Gemini, not to date this podcast, but if you're listening to this in the future, you may want to go Google that. But you're going to see who's real and who's fake. You're going to see what people are doing that's genuine and actually making a real connection and a real human style level of engagement versus people who are just playing, quite frankly, playing the algorithm game in order to get virality and then to just take off and go. And I would also say that what those large language algorithms will do is it will separate the leaders from the followers. And the leadership and leaders have always been a tiny group. But my fear is that group is just going to get smaller rather than the franchise expanding. And we need the franchise to expand.
That's a super interesting point because, I try to go watch the longest form content, read the longest form content I can, because I know how easy it is to get good writers, right? I know how easy it is to sound like, you're talking about over a 30-second clip, which is why, like, I love the Rogan style format, those super long forms, because like, if they run out of talking points, you can hear it, right? Like some of the people who I'm not fans of, I'm not going to list any names out here, but I love to go watch their long form shows because it's like, let's see if you can hold it together for longer than 3 minutes. Because if not, I now know kind of really where you are in the grand scheme of things, and no judgment, right? Like, it's great. You can have great writers, but I only want to deal with people whose like IP is actually attached in a meaningful way.
Well, and we talk a little bit about this. We've talked a little bit about this without going too much into the details of like the secret, not really secret sauce because there was no secret sauce, but sort of the nuts and bolts of the show, right? This show, I write a script. Like the show is dead simple. I read a book, I write a script, I send it to the guest. The guest has areas where they can comment. We have a conversation before we start, and then we press record and go. And then I read the book or read excerpts from the book or increasingly read summaries of the book because I want to get through the whole thing. And then we talk about it back and forth, bring forth ideas, pull things from it, and then we move on. It's dead simple. But dead simple and holding someone for 2 hours or 4 hours. Like you and I have talked for 4 hours. We talked for
Yep.
4 hours about a book that was like, what, 100 pages, maybe Miyamoto's Musashi's, a book of five rings. That's maybe 100 pages, maybe
Short read for
short
sure.
read.
But when you look at the lasting impact of it, you look at, like it doesn't have to be long, which is
No.
something I'm always trying to be better about myself because I am not succinct in my writing and my content creation or anything. And so one of the coolest things about it is we can talk for 4 hours and we could probably go again for 4 hours, right?
Oh yeah.
We could bring another actual practiced martial artist and we could go for 12 hours because of the depth of that book, right?
Oh yeah.
Which I think is important to keep in mind, that it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be, Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman for it to like have value. Sometimes it's just a slog because it needs to be a slog, but choosing to force everyone on a slog because you can't do it a different way also has some limitations.
Well, and you talk about long form versus short form. For me, the content that, particularly in the podcasting space, that
Mhm.
is not working these days, and God bless all the people who are doing it and who are struggling, but there's a massive tranche between the people who are doing micro short content. And we do, by the way, we have these two formats on our show. So we have the micro, 6 to 10 minute, sometimes, well, 2 to 4 minute, 4 to 6 minute, at the
Mhm.
max 10 minutes, micro content that you can just pick up. And it's just me talking, no guests, no music, just going, right? Then we cross the tranche and we go up the J curve all the way into that 4 hour space, which has names in it that John is not going to name. I'm not going to name. It's okay. You know who they are. You can find them, right? Um, and in between those two poles are a bunch of people doing half hour and hour long shows.
Yep.
And God bless people who are in the leadership development space. I'm not quite sure how you can talk effectively about leadership. And I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. And maybe I don't get invited as a guest onto those shows. And maybe that's fine. I've got my own show. It's cool. But I don't know how you cover the depth and breadth of leadership in 30 minutes. I don't know how you do it, or in an hour. I genuinely don't.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because I'm just not good enough to be that succinct. That might be it. Just like you, I'm not succinct either. I like long conversations with interesting people. So maybe it's a me problem, not a problem of the format. But I do see a lot of those shows in that deep ditch between what's happening at the 4 hour end and what's happening at the 10 minute end, at that micro end. And it seems like that's a place where a lot of shows go to die. And I never wanted that for this show. So
Man, I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten feedback because I've done a couple of hour-long things, right? We had a podcast, I had a live stream, and they were longer because I I like the longer conversation as well. And the advice from everyone, oh man, you got to make it shorter. You got to make it shorter. I don't want to make it shorter. I want the depth, And we're launching a new show, and it's supposed to be about an hour long, but I'm choosing very intentionally, at least on the front end, people who I know have the traits and characteristics of a long form conversation. They're deep, they're thoughtful, extremely aware of themselves, right? They're not trying to be too polished and professional, because I think that if you in poker, this is called bum hunting, but in poker, you're trying to find the easiest opportunities to make money that you possibly can. So I want to make a really high level show with deep thinkers and people sharing kind of what has worked for them. So at least during development, since the show's not live yet, I'm being very intentional, reaching out to people who I know already make good content, already are capable of having really deep conversations without it needing to be 3 hours. Because I do think that some people they need that time to walk into the depth. And then some people are just ready to jump in from the deep side, So I'm trying to shortcut that a little bit because I do know how much time it takes to to get people excited about a 3 hour show, right? I know it's not for everybody, but I'm also trying to interview like revenue people. So like, hey, can I have half of your day? No.
No.
Which is fair and fine. I get it, because honestly, if it takes half a day as me as the interviewer to get greatness out of people, I don't think I'm doing a very good job as an interviewer, right?
As an interviewer. Yeah.
So I think that that's the other part of it is who is getting value out of it. If no one is getting value out of it, then there's some hard questions, but distribution and the algorithm do play a big part on like, is anyone getting value out of it kind of thing,
Exactly. Yeah, we can We could talk about this all day, but I'm
Yeah,
sure
we
people
could.
would like to hear about the book.
I mean, compared to us complaining about like algorithmic issues, I'm sure that everyone would rather hear about this book.
Everyone would rather hear about this book. And Charles Portis and his literary life. So let's do that. Let's do that. Let's pick up with True Grit. So this is an excellent book. This is an excellent novel. It is probably one of my top 5 at minimum, top 10 at max
Really?
books. Oh
Oh,
yeah. And there's many reasons for why I love this book. But let me start off for those of you who have never read it. Maybe you haven't seen either of the films. I also have an object here that I'm going to share for folks who are watching the video. I'm going to show you something that I pulled out of a shop in Texas. So Charles Portis and True Grit. True Grit begins. Now the movie, actually, the Joel and Ethan Coen movie, begins with a quote from Proverbs 28:1. The wicked flee when no one pursues. Now, there's a comma there, or semicolon, depending upon which version of the Bible you're reading. And then there's another line behind there, which the Coen brothers did not put at the in the opening, their cold open to the film, which I think is actually important for what Portis was trying to get to in this book. So Proverbs 28:1, the wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. When you open up True Grit, Charles Portis begins with Mattie Ross. And he opens up with this description. People do not give it credence that a 14-year-old girl could leave home and go off in the wintertime to avenge her father's blood. But it did not seem so strange then, although I will say it did not happen every day. I was just 14 years of age when a coward going by the name of Tom Cheney shot my father down at Fort Smith, Arkansas, and robbed him of his life and his horse and $150 in cash money, plus 2 California gold pieces that he carried in his trouser band. And from there, from that compound sentence, we are off. Mattie Ross is the driver for this book. Now, her perspective is one of a middle-aged woman looking back on what happened to her when she was a teenager, kind of a little bit with incredulity, kind of a little bit with righteousness. And we're going to talk about her sense of moral righteousness, because that's a huge driver for everything that happens in this novel. But you begin to see just how righteous she is when she gets on the train and takes the train from Yale County all the way to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and begins to, well, she begins to walk around, start talking to people, and begins to assert herself in a way that only a 14-year-old girl who has no knowledge of sort of how the world is, quote unquote, supposed to work does. Now, full disclosure, I have a 14-year-old girl, a 13-year-old girl who lives in my house. And so eats my food. And so I know what I'm talking about here. And there's a certain level of moral authority that she brings to all of her interactions, in particular, her interactions with the man who owns the well, he owns the wagon loading place slash horse trading place, right? Horse trading location in Fort Smith, a man named Colonel Stonehill. And she goes back and forth with Colonel Stonehill about the value of the horses, about the value of the ponies. By the way, this is demonstrated in both versions of this book that were turned into the movie. One starring Jeff Bridges, that's the Ethan Coen film that was just recently released, and then of course the older film with with your friend and mine, John Wayne. And she threatens Colonel Stonehill with the attorney. She threatens him with lawyer J. Noble Daggett of Dardanelle, Arkansas. And she threatens him in such a way that he's got his own principles of negotiation and what he wants to get for the horses, and she's got her own principles, and the principles meet and clash. And the thing that you see in the first part of this book is that Mattie Ross, and I'm going to be very gentle about this, Mattie Ross is no Gen Zer stuck to her phone. She's no millennial who wants to be liked by everybody. She is fine with being disagreeable. She's okay with that. And that sets the tone for many, many things that happen later, including the entire testimony that Rooster Cogburn, who was introduced in this first part as well, gives in a trial where he shot 2 men and then maybe or maybe not moved them to a fire. And of course, when she meets Rooster coming out of the trial after he has been questioned by the lawyer about how many men he has killed and whether or not he always works in reverse when he's backing up, she says to him, and of course this is the title of the book, "They tell me you are a man with true grit." He actually doesn't know what she means. And by the way, both Jeff Bridges and John Wayne nailed this part about Rooster Cogburn's character, but they nailed it in different ways. He actually doesn't understand what she means because he is who he is. Let's open up with the literary life of Charles Portis. So who was the guy who wrote this book? Well, Charles McCall Portis was born December 28th, 1933, and died February 17th, 2020. Yeah, that's right. He died before everything kicked off with COVID. And he was an American writer. And now this is directly from his Wikipedia entry, which is very, very slim. I think Portis would have actually really, really liked this. He was the literary peer of Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, and interestingly enough, the man he's always compared to, Cormac McCarthy, which, by the way, eventually at a certain point, we will read The Road on this podcast. We'll get to that. Charles Portis lived, observed, and was hyper aware of the contradictions and complexities of the American South and West and the real people who lived there doing real things. Now, Portis wrote 5 books total. His 2 most famous were Norwood, written in 1966, and of course, True Grit in 1968. And he is an author who was, well, he had his own sense of weirdness. And I quote, as Tom Wolfe says in The New Journalism, one day Portis suddenly quit as London correspondent for the Herald Tribune. Now, he started off as a journalist, right? That was generally regarded as a very choice job in the newspaper business. This is Tom Wolfe speaking. Portis quit cold one day, just like that, without warning. And after writing his first 2 novels, Portis actually went on to live the fantasy, Wolfe says. Portis did it in a way that was so much like the way it happens in the dream. It was unbelievable. He sold both books to the movies. He made a fortune. And then he moved into a fishing shack in Arkansas. It was too, pardon my use of the word, it was too damned perfect to be true. And yet there it was, which is to say that the old dream, the novel, has never died. Close quote. By the way, Portis made $14 million from the movie adaptation of True Grit with John Wayne, and that was $14 million in 1960s, 1970s money. And I quote also from Justin Taylor in Old Weird America, who was writing in 2023, quote, Portis is a comedian of the highest order, but he is finally, as all comedians must be, a moral philosopher, because comedy, like prophecy, is always grounded in a critique of the world as it is, based on a vision of the world as it ought to be. And that comes through, I think, tremendously in his character of Mattie Ross, and less so in his character of Rooster Cogburn. And then there's this. So I am holding up, for those of you who are going to be watching the video, I found in a junk shop in Central Texas the original Capitol Record soundtrack to the original True Grit, starring John Wayne, Glenn Campbell, and Kim Darby as Mattie Ross. On the back, of course, is the pictures of the folks, and all the songs on here are sung by Glenn Campbell. Now, in the Joel and Ethan Coen film, Glenn Campbell's role was played by Matt Damon. Matt Damon did not sing. John Wayne's part was played by Jeff Bridges. I already brought that up. And of course, Kim Darby's part was played by Haley Steinfeld. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. But this is a great album. Side 1 is True Grit with vocals by Glenn Campbell, Rooster, Mattie and Little Blackie, A Dastardly Deed, Papa's Things. Side 2 is True Grit, Chen Li and the General, Big Trail, Cogburn Country, and then of course True Grit, B-side, vocals by Glenn Campbell. So I'm holding it up on the video. It has a great cover. I've been holding on to this for the last 6 months because I knew I was going to be doing this podcast. And I've been waiting to show it to John, and he is laughing right now on the video. You'll be able to see it because it is an example of old weird America. I could not, when I found this from Paramount Pictures, when I found that album, my wife was like, "What are you doing? We don't even have a record player at home." And I was like, "I need to get this though. It doesn't matter. I need to have this." So I have it now. So with that, I'd like to kick it over to John. Go ahead. Yeah.
You said you had something to show me, but you didn't give me any advance notice, which I now appreciate. But I do feel a little bit broadsided by this because me and my wife are big record collectors. And every time we go anywhere, including antique stores, she's digging, like doesn't care about anything else other than salt and pepper shakers and old vinyls. Like nice. It's crazy. And so we have quite the collection here. She would lose her mind. And we were rewatching the movies over the weekend and reading some trivia and going a little bit deeper about it. And Glenn Campbell is quoted as saying, "You know what? Before that movie, I never acted in a movie. Upon seeing it, my record is still the same," which made me so I saw that movie out of time, right? Like my mom and my grandmother are both huge John Wayne fans. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I had seen the movie is like part of learning about the greatness of John Wayne. Right. Mm-hmm. So yeah, my grandmother was just obsessed with like the Western style of John Wayne, not so much the war stuff, but McClintock and the Quiet Man. Mm-hmm. And then they're always saying like, "Fill your hands," like this kind of this thing. And then I was like, "Where is this from?" And then we watched the movie. I didn't read the book until later. And it was kind of because the original movie doesn't really follow the book as closely as the Coen version does, which I'd kind of forgotten about.
Yeah, no, it does not. And that was, by the way, a knock against the original movie is that it seemed too much of a John Wayne vehicle.
Yeah. It's not really meant to be about him. If anything, he's the belligerent anti-hero.
Right. But I think that, and I'll go ahead and say it early, I think the thing that the John Wayne film has that the Joel and Ethan Coen film doesn't is that sense of moral righteousness. Like there are some there's elements that are in the book, and yes, the Joel and Ethan Coen book or movie hews very closely to the book. But Joel and Ethan, I think it was Joel Coen that wrote it. I don't think it was Ethan. I think Ethan produced that one, although I might be wrong. I'd have to go back and look. But I think they stripped the more moralistic elements out of it. And without that, which you do get in Kim Darby, by the way, you do get in her portrayal of Mattie Ross, you do get the sense that she's a moral actor in the world. And her moralism comes from, and we're going to talk about this a lot today, but it comes from a particular spot in her perception of the world,
Agreed.
And you kind of get at the end of the Joel and Ethan Coen movie when as a middle-aged lady, and I'm not giving anything away here because you can go watch the movie, but she walks up to the Old West shooting show or whatever. Yep. And Frank James doesn't get up. She's like, "Don't get up, trash."
Yeah.
But there were elements of that all throughout the book where she was talking to people like that the whole time.
100%. My wife and I watched both of them again, and I was kind of talking about the pacing differences between the two films, right? Because the first one is so much more backstory and everything. The newer version, I would say is closer to the book as far as like the overall view, but the pacing of it is very different. But the John Wayne one does do a better job of like showing that no matter what had happened to her father, Mattie would have carried out those same actions, right? Like
Right.
the righteousness of Mattie, if he came home like missing one of those gold pieces, she would have done the same actions,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Whereas in the second movie, it kind of seems like, hey, like it got, she seems a very stalwart, right?
Hmm.
Person, right? It's a great word.
Yep.
But it kind of seems like she's almost forced into this because of the nature of events. Whereas I think the first one does a much better job of being like, hey, this is just who she is, and she's going to move people, you
Right.
know. And
Yeah.
I think there's weight to that because I do think that a lot of people are much more concerned about being themselves and being direct and different things like that. And when you're not brought up to be that, it's harder to step into that spot and when and if you have to, professionally speaking, right?
Right.
Because Mattie was brought up as the smartest person, on that farm. She's handling the book. She's doing all these things. She is brought up with a lane of authority that creates this righteousness and thinking that I think most people today don't have until they find it much, much later professionally.
Well, and Kim Darby was, I mean, she was in her 20s.
Yeah, she was 21 when they made that thing, and apparently John Wayne was not a fan of her because he wanted his daughter to be in that role, and they told him no. And so apparently they didn't say like two words off camera to each other, which is kind of an interesting thing. But
That's
apparently John
interesting.
Wayne was not the greatest human on set. Just going back and looking at some of that stuff. Not here to judge the guy. Not
I,
I wasn't
you
there,
know, it
but
it it took me many years. You talk about growing up with your grandmother being a really big fan of John Wayne. So weird. It's weird. So in my family, my father was a huge fan of Clint Eastwood, but didn't
okay,
care a whit about John Wayne. And it
interesting.
kind of sort of makes sense because my father was from, I mean, my father was born in the late 1940s. And so
Okay,
for African Americans in the late 1940s who were born at that time and then came of age in the late 60s and went to Vietnam in the 70s, yeah, they grew up watching John Wayne, but it was more like an American institution that was representative of, quite frankly, white male culture. And they
yeah,
wouldn't have framed it that way. That's how we frame it now. They would
yep,
have just said John Wayne is racist and doesn't like black people. That's how they would have framed it, and they would have just moved on with the rest of their lives,
yeah,
right? Whereas Clint Eastwood seemed a lot more,
grittier.
you're right, a lot more realistic.
That's
Um,
interesting. I've never thought about that before. I've never really been a Clint Eastwood fan. Like I've never really done the deep
right.
dive. It's never really done anything to me. And honestly, like rewatching this and like recently rewatched McClintock recently
Hmm.
for like the first time in years, many, many,
Yeah.
many years. And I'm like, oh yeah, that doesn't have the same pull on me that it used to. Right. And
Yeah.
I don't know how
Well,
much of that is just age or that being out of time or my shifts. Just
I think it's probably all of that, but I also think that John Wayne is fundamentally, in a different way than Clint Eastwood, fundamentally always going to be a frozen in his own era.
agreed. Yeah. And because
Um,
because the movies he made, it's easier to kind of put him off to the side, I would say,
right.
right? Because like everything is about him being larger than life, right? Like you watch like Hellfighters and even The Shootist, which is like
Hmm.
like like that's movie star movies from a guy who's like the first movie star almost. Whereas,
Correct.
the way that they've worked with like Clint and everyone else now, they're way more approachable. They're human beings in and of themselves a lot of times.
Well, not only that, but like Clint also did movies that were much more of a challenge for him because he couldn't step over John Wayne.
Yeah.
John Wayne was too big a star. So he had to go to Italy. He did Rawhide in the 50s, couldn't get hired to do anything in America, runs across Sergio Leone and goes to Italy. And he's
I
like,
did not
okay,
know
well,
this.
yeah.
This is
And
all
like,
new
I'm just going to
information
make,
for me.
yeah,
This
I'm
is
just going to go
interesting.
make movies there. And it was there that he figured out, I think, although he's never said it, but I think it was there he figured out that, oh, there's something more to this movie game than just showing up and being the guy from Rawhide.
Hmm.
Um, that's fundamentally different. And actually, I would trace Eastwood's growth and direction alongside or parallel to sort of the new directors when they were new of
Hmm.
Scorsese, Spielberg, Lucas. Well, Spielberg and Lucas were the next generation, but Scorsese, what's his name, who did Apocalypse Now? Coppola, thank you. Knew eventually I would have it. But Scorsese, Coppola,
I like how you thanked yourself.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks me for the help.
Thanks me. I would like to thank me for showing up every day. But it's this parallel idea in Eastwood's career that you don't just have to be a movie star, right? There's not just one path. There's all these other paths. John Wayne was very happy being directed by John Ford. He was very happy being the guy.
Yeah, he just wanted to be handled.
He just wanted to be handled.
Yeah, he didn't want to. And we're speaking a little bit out of school because the guy's gone. But
Right.
like eventually, but you see this with everybody though, right? They build the team, right? DiCaprio loves working in Scorsese films, and Scorsese loves writing films for him because he knows what he's capable of doing and stuff. And I sometimes see people go after people, right? Because even the Coen brothers have their regulars who they love to have in movies and stuff like that. And people are like, can't you find someone new? It's like when you know who to write for, like, and you can trust them with the work, there's something special and unique that if you've not created something creative that has to be performed by someone else that you probably don't actually understand yet.
Now, once again, we have talked about the movies, and we have not talked about Portis. Portis would be happy about this. He'd be like, yeah, that's fine. I'm going to take my $14 million and go to my shack in Arkansas.
Absolutely.
I love that about Charles Portis. I love it that he only wrote 5 novels. I love it that he said the $14 million was enough. I'm going to retreat and go do the thing. Like there's an article in one of the links that I sent you, or an essay in one of the links that I sent you. I think it's not from Old Weird America. It might be from Literary Hub, where they were trying to reach out to him. The author, the journalist, was trying to reach out to him. And, he's like, well, I mean, yeah, you can come to Arkansas and interview me if I have time in my day. And you could always find him at the bar, like having a drink, just hanging out. And no one would know that he was Charles Portis. The man had zero, apparently, social media presence, didn't care about any of that nonsense. I'm sure the Coens reached out to him and his estate when they did the film, and I'm sure he was like, yeah, that's fine. Just make sure the check is signed with my name on it. He never had a wife. He never had kids. He just wrote his books and hung out and fished. And I think that's what got Tom Wolfe. I think that's what got Tom, because Tom Wolfe is so the opposite. Tom Wolfe wanted to be, well, you mentioned handled, right? He wanted to be handled by the New York glitterati press folks, right? Bonfire. I mean, you don't write a book like Bonfire of the Vanities where you're just lambasting everybody in New York in the 80s without wanting to attract some attention to yourself.
Absolutely.
Portis, on the other hand, everything that I've read about the man, he didn't care about any of that. And by the way, $14 million, the interest on $14 million is fine. The interest payment is enough to feed you for a year. What do you need? You have no expenses.
Well, I mean, in one of those articles he sent me, it talked about that he got $300,000 at the time just for the rights of that movie. Like that man doesn't need to do anything else. If he's already like kind of planted the flag and said, you know what, I don't want to do it this way anymore. Like, I think there's a big story here for everyone who is like starting a business right now, because I think there's a lot of people who are deluding themselves to points of failure because they're trying to go build a big, huge conglomerate thing so that way it's going to be sexy and everything else like that. When really, you just need to show up and do your job, right? Do the writing, do the outreach, right? Whatever that looks like. It doesn't have to be great and sexy, but it needs to work, and there's a lot of people, I think right now, who we were kind of talking about this before we hit record. They're doing it for the star power. They're not doing it for the sake of the work itself. And the thing that I appreciate this about this book and the essays you sent over, because I read them, gave me a whole new perspective on the guy, because I don't really know that much about Portis. That this book, my copy of it is, because we're collectors, and Mel had read it as well. And so she came home with this very old version. I don't even know the date on this thing of mine, and it's just always been on the thing, but I've never read anything else by him yet, but I'm going to now. And it's just, if you're doing it for the sake of the work, it shows up differently than when you're doing it like the star power kind of like situation. And we see this with actors, and we see this with musicians. We see this with everybody who's doing anything. There's the marketing path, there's the hey, look at me path, and then there's the hey, like I do good work and I don't care if you like it or not. And sometimes they can be together, but more often than not, you do have to kind of go pick one or the other.
This is something that I have been hit with hit with as feedback, particularly sharply in the last couple of years. So consistently over the course of my career, such as it were, the last 20 years of me doing stuff, I've always been accused, intermittently usually, of being spread too thin, which sometimes I am. Like currently, I'm probably spread too thin. Not focusing on one thing nearly enough. And if I just focused on this one thing, I'd be genius. Okay. And really in the last couple of years, and really within the last 6 months, people have been coming to me saying, if you just focused on this, if you just focused on this, you just focused on this. And I've always pushed back on that. And by the way, it's personal feedback. It's also professional feedback. So this is becoming at me from a lot of different areas, right? And I always push back on that by saying, thank you. I appreciate your perspective on what I'm doing out here. I'm peripatetic. I have multiple different interests in a lot of different areas, and I like to do a lot of different things. And I'm focused on doing the work for the sake of the work. And I like it how you made that distinction. I'm doing the work for the sake of the work. I'm not doing the work for all of these other multiplicity of things. I'm not doing the work to get famous. I mean, if fame comes, okay, I'll take it, but I'm not doing that. I would be doing these 5 things that I'm doing currently if anybody were paying attention to me or not.
1000%.
Because this is the work.
Yeah.
For me, that's the work. And I get it. For you, you have to, put on a suit and get in a car and drive somewhere, or maybe you put on your flip-flops and you show up on camera and you get on Zoom somewhere, like whatever you got to do. I get it. And that's the only thing you have in your psychological space to handle. I get that. That's okay. I can handle multiple things in my psychological space. I'm okay. But all those things aren't paying you.
I relate to this.
You let me worry about that.
Yeah. If you have the view of my bank accounts, then, we can talk about all the data points, right? Which is the other
right.
part that people kind of get lumped in with this. Like the thing that I've learned about myself, is that if I don't have an outlet of some way, shape, or form, and for a long time that was martial arts, and before that it was poker. For a long time, it was those things together. But when I stopped training martial arts in my first school, it was as I was starting this business, right? Mm-hmm. And I also was not playing poker. So what that meant was all of my focus, all of my thinking, all of my concerns and fears, and was put into just this very small box, which is my business, right? Mm-hmm. And if I don't have a puzzle to work on, I will create one inside of the business, right? Mm-hmm. And my grandmother, who passed away in February 2020, she's the one who was the reason why I read True Grit and have seen all these John Wayne movies. One time I was working at a job and she goes, "What happens when you get it figured out?" Right? Because I job hopped a lot, right? As a salesperson, it's not quite as detrimental to job hop. And I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "You're going to get bored and you're going to figure this out. And then you're going to get bored. What happens then?" And I was 24, 25, and I was avoidant of this quality about myself. So I was like, no, those other jobs were garbage, bad leadership, bad bosses, all this other stuff. And she was like, okay. And was just fine leaving it just like that. Fast forward, she's gone. I'm doing some journaling and thinking, and this comes back of holy crap, I need the puzzle. I need something to engage my mind in a worthwhile way. And when I don't have it in front of me, I will create it. So to that end, the past year, I've been practicing guitar. I got a guitar and I'm working with a coach, and I'm also starting to do woodworking as as a more physical outlet, because guitar is great, super great for my brain and my thinking and stuff like this, but it wasn't in my body enough to really kind of take over for the martial arts. So now, actually this weekend, I spent kind of building my workbench for the garage, because I'm going to get into, wood turning and building bowls and cool stuff like that, just as another way to have a puzzle outlet, so that way I don't create it inside of my business. But I think, first of all, I think if you're running a business and you're not making content, you're choosing to make it difficult for no great reason except your ego. And when you can make your content around the things you'd be doing anyway, like the work, reading the books that you would be reading anyway, publishing the notes you would be writing anyway, publishing the interviews with other peers in the same spot who are capable of having qualified conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Why not make that content? Why not try to help out other people? And that's when I think it really gets beautiful and good. But I think when you're making content because you think it's going to help the business, not because it's something you're really invested in doing, is when you start trying to chase that star path, right? And then it's gonna hurt when you wake up and realize that the sexy business thing that you're trying to make sexy but also keep real is not hitting either one of these marks.
It also moves you away from the fame machine that social media is.
1000% for sure.
And this is the love-hate, and I don't know, I really shouldn't say love. It's neutral then hate for me. It really is. It's neutral then hate. Most of the time I'm neutral about social media platforms because I realize they're businesses and they're going to do what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. It's fine. Algorithm going to algorithm, to paraphrase, right? It's fine. Whatever. And I'll post content and I know content gets suppressed. I'm not complaining about it because algorithm going to algorithm. It's fine.
Yep.
But when you're creating content for the business and the content is a lead generator to something else because it has to serve a purpose, now you're going to get caught in the virality trap. You're going to get caught in the space of trying to do what TikTok wants, which is not what's best for your business. It's not even what's best for your leadership or your team. It's what's best for TikTok. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a point that's been made multiple times by multiple people. And it always needs to be made again because new people need to hear it.
Absolutely. Right. There's always a vanity metric and there's always a metric that matters. Right. I have a podcast that's a 0.01% podcast in the worlds of sales and business, right? We have 85 episodes and everything else like that. But in the grand scheme of things, you say those things, it's not that big. It's really not. And to your point, I think the other side of this that we're kind of not talking about is that if you post enough, if you create for long enough, your sample size becomes indicative of what you should be expecting, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the thing that you said a second ago about doing this for 5 years, I can do anything for 5 years and then I'll know. That is you collecting a big enough sample so that you're not lying to yourself. You're not choosing someone else's best practices over what you're able to do. And I talk about this with people because I post about consultative selling. Not flashy selling, not high pressure selling. I don't talk about marketing. I don't talk about all these other things that people are super excited about. I talk about having better sales conversations, which most people are trying to get away from sales conversations entirely, right? They'd rather market all the way to conversion versus having to have a conversation with people.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to get the reach that other people are. But when you do it, I've been posting daily on LinkedIn since 2017, 2016, somewhere around there. I can go look at my data now and I can tell when I'm actually being algo suppressed versus I'm just not writing well. I'm not connecting with the actual people who normally read my stuff. Because if you do enough to actually collect a benchmark, the benchmark stands on its own merit.
Yeah. 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 Sometimes it's you and sometimes it's the algorithm. But very often, if you're going to take ownership, we actually just did a shorts episode about this. If you're going to be a leader, you need to take ownership and accountability. And of course, it doesn't start with the algorithm. It starts with
absolutely
you. Just like with Mattie Ross, it started with her. Just like with Rooster Cogburn, it started with him.
Real quick, what I love is they talk about this very topic in the book.
They do.
I have notes on it here. I'm so glad we kind of segued here because I thought that this was amazing. Okay, I'm on page 40.
Yes.
I'm on page 40 and 41 of my book, which is a hardback. It's an older version. Yeah. But essentially, let's see here. Where to go? But the magazines of today do not know a good story when they see one. They would rather print trash. They say my article is too long and discursive. Nothing is too long or too short if you have a true or interesting tale or what I call a graphic writing style. Combined with educational aims. I do not fool around with newspapers. They're always after me for historical write-ups, but when the talk gets around to money, the paper editors are most of them are cheapskates. Mm-hmm. I think because I have a little money, I will be happy to fill up their Sunday columns just to see my name in print like Lucille Biggers Langford and Florence Mabry Whiteside. And then it kind of goes on again as well. It says, where to go?
The paper editors are great ones for reaping where they have not sown.
Yes,
My
absolutely.
God, what an insight! By the way, I marked that too in my copy. I
Mhm.
did too. Um, Another game they have is to send reporters out to talk to you and get your stories free.
Yep.
I know the young reporters are not paid well, and I would not mind helping those boys out with their scoops if they could ever get anything straight.
She's talking about the same stuff, right? Without and it was funny because when I jumped back in and started reading this book, I wasn't ready for how it's written because it
Mm-hmm.
just drops you in and you were
Oh yeah.
going, right? And they do a really good job of showing how rigid and how moral and how righteous that she is and how she carries it, right? From the
Yeah.
jump all the way through. But I was reading the first, up to that point of page 40 in my book, I was kind of like, oh, this is going to be a slog. This is going to be a slog. Like, this is not well, like in my head, I was like, this is not very well written. But when you take into consideration what it's supposed to be, right? A memoir for 30, 40 years later from a very direct woman, which is not always easy for women to be direct now because I coach women in sales roles who struggle with being direct because sometimes that's not okay. They get labeled as a business bitch to, it's not my language, but it's common in the place of being too direct, too focused. Right. And Mattie is a really great representation of like what a direct woman can be, right? The other part of this is you just have to make the decision that no one else's opinions really matter, right? And Mattie is steeped in that. But until you make that decision, you're probably not as rooted as you think you are in your conversations and your thoughts.
Let's talk about that because this is where we're going now. This is again the beautiful segue into the next pieces of True Grit. So as we move forward in the book, by the way, when you read True Grit, and this is just a structural thing that you're going to notice, there's no chapter headings in the book. So when you go in there and read it, there's no chapter headings. And that goes directly to that whole idea that John was just talking about. It's a brilliant observation of it just dropping you in, and you're like, you're in the car and you're going for the gold, right? And Portis, I think, writes it this way because he wanted you to get the sense that you are inside events as they are occurring, and you're also experiencing this person's life as it is occurring. And then you're going to drop right back out again. You're going to drop in and you're going to drop out. And that's it. There's bookends on Mattie Ross, right? There's bookends on Rooster Cogburn. There's bookends on LaBeouf, right? The Glenn Campbell / Matt Damon character. Like there's bookends on that, right? And so, but inside those bookends, what happens inside of those bookends is critical. And so in the next part of this book, as we are going from Rooster and Mattie meeting outside of the courthouse, we move into Rooster's life and we get a little bit of a glimpse as to how he's living. And now this book was written in 1968. Now there are terms in this book that if you read them will offend modern ears, right? Yep. But because we actually, I believe fundamentally in free speech. I always have to say this at least one time per episode. I fundamentally believe in free speech. I also fundamentally believe that we have to take the author as he was in his time, which is why I don't get upset about Ernest Hemingway using the N-word or Mark Twain using the N-word. We can talk about it in the terms of 2024, but neither of those gentlemen were writing in 2024.
I have a random question about this
go
idea
ahead.
because I've never gotten asked this before.
Go ahead.
How do you feel about guys like Quentin Tarantino and how they use that word? Because like I know he gets a lot of flack for it, but I'm also I'm only asking this because you said the thing, like I'm taking them at their time, Right.
So you're talking about Django Unchained. So let me give you my
I'm talking about just in general, because like that's not the only movie where he's a little bit prolific.
It's not the only movie, but it is the movie that sort of put the stamp on the rear end of the on the southbound end of the northbound cow. That was where he was going, right? And I read the script. I got an unreleased script for Django through some connections that I had and previously years ago, and read it, and they wanted me to give them feedback. And the feedback that I gave them was, I don't think you could make this movie. I don't think this movie can be made. The cultural sensitivity that is current, and this was way back. This is like probably 2004, maybe 2005.
Oh, wow.
So it was early. It was early before this movie got out, right?
Yeah.
And I used to have those deep connections. I don't have them anymore because I've moved on and done other things in my life. But I was like, I don't think you can do this. I don't think this movie can be filmed. I think he's leaning into something here that doesn't necessarily need to be leaned into, because this was way before. This was in this. He was writing this script during a time when the backwash of the 1990s film culture was still fairly strong. And so you could be a little bit transgressive, and no one would kind of jump on your stuff. And then he released it. I can't remember when Django came out. I could find out. But he releases it, and he doesn't get nearly as much flack for it as I thought he would. And I thought, well, clearly I was wrong about that. And the reason I think I was wrong, it's taken me many years to kind of understand, but the reason I think I was wrong is multivariant. But I think the core of it is that what we do now, we are not thinking far enough ahead in the future of the ramifications or the consequences.
Oh,
So
man.
it's
Agreed.
easy to look in the past. And this is why I'm never a fan of statues being torn down or bases being renamed. I will never support that. This is why. Because when you rename the base or tear down the statue, what you're saying is we are better morally than those people then. Except the problem is Django, Unchained, or Pulp Fiction, or name your movie here, may be censored in the future by a group of people with moral claims that don't match what's here currently. So let's step a little bit lightly on the moral claims. Let's try to contextualize what actually happened in the past. Let's raise people to understand that historical context and appreciate it. And then here's the other thing. If you want to put a statue next to the one that talks about what's going on with that statue, do that. Spend a little public dollars doing that. You want to rename the base? Actually, here's a better idea. Put the one name of the base on the top and then put another name of the base on the bottom. Do that. Because here's the thing. Just erasing the history doesn't eliminate it. And it actually doesn't eliminate the hurt that may have been caused by that history. And by the way, the people who may have been hurt by that history, not all of them, but many of them are no longer in this mortal coil.
Agreed.
Meanwhile, the people who are dealing with Jamie Foxx dropping the N-word every 5 seconds are alive right now.
Yeah.
And that's eroding us right now. I think it's multivariant, but I think that for me, that's the core reason right there. It's this high sense of moral superiority while we've got this other thing going on over here that we're just like, oh, that's just entertainment.
So it's like virtue signaling, in your opinion?
Yes. And virtue signaling to what end?
Well, I think like I like
and
the
maybe
part
I'm
that
wrong
you
on
said.
that, by the way. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe that's bad analysis. I'd be willing to listen to different analysis on that. But for me, like I said, I read the original story and I thought this can't happen. We can't do this. And apparently I was wrong.
That's interesting. I wasn't thinking about like statues and bases and stuff like that. I mean, personally, and maybe this is weird, but like the line I've been drawing in my head, because like I've not really heard so much about like renaming bases, but like I see a lot about the statues coming down and stuff like that. And maybe this is head trash. Maybe I'm making this like a convenient, easy way to hide, but like I think a statue is reverence,
There's an
right?
argument to be made for that. Yeah.
It's worship almost, like holding this person up as, the example, versus a base with a name, like and maybe this is me just trying to make it convenient, so please call me if that's true, but like, a base that has a name that just might be leading back to someone who's had some, less than stellar experiences with people of the world is different than like a statue saying like, hey, this guy is worth public homage.
Well, okay, let's talk about statues for just a second. So university, no, it wasn't university, it was Penn State University, Joe Paterno. Okay, no, almost no one remembers this now, but at the time when Joe Paterno's legacy was being tainted by the scandal of child abuse by one of his coaches. I can't remember.
Sandusky stuff, right?
Jerry Sandusky stuff, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I was coaching rugby at a college that I will not name here, and I was assistant coach on staff, and the coach, she made the point, female coach, she made the point, it's stuck with me for years. She said, "This is why you don't put up statues of people while they're alive," and she just walked away.
Oh, dip.
And I was like, that's an excellent point, because when someone's dead, what you're doing by putting up a statue, to your point, is worship and reverence. Absolutely, for sure. There's a very strong argument to be made about idol worship around that, which I would object to that. Just if we were tearing down the statues because they're idol worship, not a problem with that. I'd be all on board with that. I'd be like, yeah, absolutely. That's correct. That's the correct alignment of where we're thinking about the reality. But when we are putting up statues of people who are alive currently, we don't know the whole story. The first report is often the wrong report.
Absolutely, for sure.
And so we don't need a first report. We need a second or third or fourth report. Now, the statues that we're talking about tearing down, like Robert E. Lee, we've gotten all the reports on Robert E. Lee.
Agreed.
We're never going to be able to go get Robert E. Lee's ghost and make him be 2024. Like, it's never going to happen, or 2025 or 2026 or 2027 or whatever you're listening to this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to happen. And so what exactly are we trying to do by tearing down the statue of Robert E. Lee? Are we trying to tear down that object of worship, or are we trying to do something else? And I want us to be honest in our sales process of what you're selling. Because I'll buy it if you're honest.
Yeah, but if you're not, we're going to know.
We're going to know. And we may not know where the dishonesty is. We may not know where to spot that.
Absolutely.
But we've got a sense. We've been selling to each other ever since, well, either Adam and Eve or the cavemen, depending upon what your perspective is. But we've been selling to each other since the beginning.
1,000%. Right?
We're really good salespeople. And we can spot a scam. We may not know where it is, but we can spot a scam.
And, I think about this a lot, right? Because both you and I live in Texas, right? Not super far apart from each other, right? Like if we decided to hang out as humans in real life, right? It's about a 30-minute drive. So nothing crazy. But like reading this book really brought to light this thing that I think about. Imagine not having access to global news, right? Like I try to put some pretty big walls between myself and the news cycles and stuff like that, because it just winds me up and then I can't do anything about it. And trying to be a stoic person, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't serve me. But imagine, only being able to read the Granbury Gazette, the Fort Worth Star Telegram.
Right.
You're not the information you're actually getting news on is a microscopic pen in relation to the actual events that are going on around the world. But that's what I like so much about these two things or those 2 points is they're talking about how tightly the narratives are confined, and not, the thing we're talking about now is when you want to be real with people, you just don't get like the mileage and the push. But like back then, if you wanted to be real with people and it didn't fit their agenda, you just didn't get anything.
You didn't get anything.
Right.
Well, and people were comfortable pushing back on you. And this is again reflected in sort of how we look at the book. So Colonel Stonehill, right? Mattie Ross tells him, you're not looking at things in the right light. And he goes, I'm looking at it in the light of God's eternal truth. Who says that out loud?
Well, you know what? I can tell you exactly who says those kinds of things, right? The people who say those kinds of things are the people who go all over salespeople because they're doing a job. I can't believe you would ever think that I need your help. Can you, right? And they get all high and mighty. Like salespeople have to deal with trying to be like Mattie Ross without actually being like Mattie Ross the majority of the time, because sales leaders and lots of leaders, especially people who think they understand how sales works but haven't ever actually stood in the stream, love to task everyone else to go be diehards that they're not willing to do themselves, which is eternally frustrating as a sales coach and trainer, because they're not even capable of showing up and doing these conversations to the level of quality that they're expecting of everyone else to do so. And then it's convenient because they get to say, well, I'm not really a salesperson. It's like, cool, but you're going to go put massive goals on other people around things that they cannot control because you think you can read the math, but you just told me that you don't know how to do this job. Like, all day long, man. It's every conversation I have. It's very frustrating. And I have to tell most of those people no, because my only real big rule is I won't work with tyrants, right? And if you're going to tell someone else what to do in the stream that you've never stood in, you are a tyrant. I'm sorry. You need to take some calls. You need to take some conversations. You need to realize what it's like to move a meeting and have that potentially like ruin your month before you start telling other people, just don't take no for an answer, because that's not actually how the real world works. So I love this negotiation piece of Mattie and the Colonel, because she's given it to him, right?
Oh God, she is delivering it.
She has it planned from the jump. And I think that the first movie does a better job of showing just how strategic and thoughtful and intentional she went into that conversation with a plan, right? And I have to talk about this with people all the time. If you don't have a plan in a conversation, you are someone else's plan.
Correct.
So she goes into there with a plan. She's pushing and pushing and pushing, and she knows the levers that she can do. Like, I have a lawyer. We have a refund. It's what is going to play and what's going to advance and what's going to get it shut down. But that exchange in the book and then in both of the movies, I think is very well done, because our culture is not built around haggling, right? And we're moving rapidly in a direction to where people are doing everything they can to avoid salespeople. Now, salespeople have kind of done this to themselves, right? Like I'm not saying that, but the people who were just doing the job versus the people who were handing out all these touches and outreach and goals and everything else like this, we got to give the people who are just doing the work a little benefit of the doubt that they're not making all the decisions, because they probably wouldn't be doing terrible outreach the way that they are currently.
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. Well, and here's another character who's living with who needs the benefit of the doubt. And what you said to me about the leaders who don't have no clue what it is to sit in a sale and potentially have that fall off the cliff, right? We've got to talk about LaBeouf. Oh my God,
We
this
got to
guy.
talk about
We've got to talk about this guy.
Okay, so first of all, what a piece of trivia that I learned, which blew my mind, was that Glenn Campbell was not supposed to be the actor. He was supposed to be Elvis. Did you know that?
I did not know that it was supposed to be Elvis.
Yeah, it was supposed to be Elvis, but he couldn't do it. So that's where the Glenn Campbell thing kind of came along, and then
Wow,
yeah,
that would have
like
been a totally different movie.
totally different movie. When I mean astronomically different. I don't think he could have done the job that LaBeouf does in the first movie well. Now, I think Matt Damon does a better job than Glenn Campbell, but he's a better actor with better skill. And then also the movie being paced so differently is very different,
Yeah, the
you know.
pacing is different. I struggled a little bit with Matt Damon in his role in with him as LaBeouf, only because I thought, and this is a John McWhorter linguistic, sort of critique. You've got 19th century words falling out of a 21st century guy's mouth.
Yeah, he's like Brad Pitt and Troy. He doesn't do a good job of like
Right.
affecting, an accent that makes sense.
Right. Brad, I'm glad you brought that analogy because, and I know Brad Pitt's like 60 now, so he's now, I mean, he's now a grown man. He's long since a grown man. But I always thought of him as an actor, as just being a sort of a glorified pool boy, basically.
Who, Brad
Um,
Pitt?
oh yeah. Oh yeah. Whereas Matt Damon has worked to reinvent himself multiple times over in multiple different films, right?
Okay.
So, and I can give him credit for that. And I appreciate the fact that he's done that while also seemingly avoiding scandal, avoiding political nonsense that sort of ruins actors' careers these days. I don't think the guy tweets. I appreciate that. I suspect who he voted for, but it's not confirmed. Thank God for that. I can go watch a movie with him and it's fine. I don't have to be sitting there the whole time thinking, like I don't have any of that. I don't have any of that. What do you call it? Mileage with Matt Damon.
Do you carry
Um,
that a lot in movies and stuff?
do I carry
Or
that? No. Well,
I try, right. We're way off topic here, but
we are way off topic. We're in the weeds.
I try to
It's
give
okay.
people credit for the art. Um, and then I try to give them a wide berth. Now, like some people go too far, like I still have Kanye albums, but I'm not listening to his streaming stuff, but I'm not going to go burn the albums because the music's are
Right.
amazing, right? Like, sorry, not going to even kind of equivocate on that. But then it's like, I know people who really hate Kevin Hart because of some of the stuff that he's kind of said about, the gay and trans community and stuff like that. And, I'd rather someone be real than get a fake apology on social media
Yep.
because your publicist or your team told you that you should go apologize out of fear of being canceled. Like,
Well, I
I
think
mean, ideally, we don't make stupid statements anyway over the megaphone of social media, but he is meant to be a polarizing figure because he is a comedian, right?
right.
I really thank you for the essays on this because I was not really able to kind of think about this book as a comedy until
It
I read those
is.
two things, but it very much is like it's absurd kind
It
of
is
when I think
absurd.
about it. Yeah.
Well, so talk about absurdity. LaBeouf, runs into Mattie Ross,
Yeah.
not
In
in
the
sort
middle
of
of nowhere,
in the
like in the
middle of
middle
nowhere.
and knows who she is and knows her mom and like everything is
Right.
okay. And like in the movie, she just wakes up and the guy's in her room.
Right.
Creepy as hell.
Boo, creeper. Like, that's okay. Now I'm off put just from the jump on that.
1000%. Yeah.
And by the way, I think both Kim Darby and Haley Steinfeld, I think they both captured that, but I think that's just a thing that women have about men who show up creepily. Like, I don't think that
Yeah.
that's anything to them as far as their acting chops go. I think that's just how women respond.
Yeah.
And
You
then
learn to deal with it as a woman, I would think.
exactly. And
Mhm.
then LaBeouf doubles down with Rooster Cogburn. And he doubles down with Rooster Cogburn, which is amazing in this part of the book. He doubles down with Rooster Cogburn on number one being a Texas Ranger, which amused the heck out of me. But then number two, on being a Texas Ranger. He had nothing else. Nothing else underneath his character to kind of lean him. And I think Damon gives more depth to that character, particularly at the end where he shakes Mattie Ross's hand and then sort of rides off. That doesn't happen in the original film. Glenn Campbell kind of plays it a little more, I won't say goofy, but he does play it as a grown man who's dealing with a little kid. And he's like, why am I dealing with this little kid? I'm a Texas Ranger, for God's sakes. And that ties into what you were saying about leaders not understanding how sales works. I don't have to understand how sales works. I'm the leader. That's LaBeouf. That's him. And so, his character gets pushed along. And, eventually Rooster decides that, we've had about enough of this, right? And I'm not gonna deal with you. And of course, he draws down on him, and LaBeouf backs off. And now there's this constant tension between these two men, and it is, you can read into it patriarchal tension, which is typically how most people would read it, I think, these days. But at a deeper level, this is a tension of competency, and that's what you get in the True Grit, in the Ethan Coen movie, the newer one.
You
don't get so much of that tension in the original, but it is definitely there. And I think they don't get it there because the time in which that movie was made, 66, 67, 68, I think it was shot in 66 and 67, and then it was, of course, released in 68. But I think that tension didn't exist because, and here's what's different about our time than it was then. If you were a 20-year-old guy, you were a grown man.
Yeah. That's the most fascinating part of this, right? Is realizing just how different we are. She's 14 going off and doing this thing. And while it's part of the shock of reading the book is just realizing my daughter's 12.
Right.
Like, man, I'm not, hey dad, I'm gonna go, no, you're not. I'm going with you. Let's go, kind of situation and stuff like that. So part of it was just this kind of shock. And it's funny to bring this up because as I'm reading it, I'm having this moment of oh, is my dissonance here just because her age, or how much of it is because it's a woman or a female, right? In the part, because you read Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, these other kind of heroic younger kid going off and doing adult things on their own and stuff like that. And I've not read those books in a very long time. And maybe it would ring the same alarm bells as a parent and an adult that reading this did. But, I'm also trying to test to figure out, is it weird just because it's a little girl and I'm not used to that? Or is it weird because she's taking off and crossing state lines and going into territories that we don't have any jurisdiction in? And
I'm going to go into the Choctaw Nation. Good luck.
And literally can't, is so righteous and so driven, can't even understand where the perilous nature of this thing is, right?
No.
And then he's challenging her. Hey, there's not going to be food and inns and beds and stuff like that. And she's like, well, we went on a hunt last summer. It was fine. And it's just oh man, I can remember being a very young salesperson trying to sell investments to people, and I'm talking about, well, you can do this over here. It's going to be fine. And, I'm talking to people that were alive during the Depression who have socks older than me because they were alive during the Depression. So they don't throw anything out. So of course I don't resonate. Of course it's BS. Of course it's talking to their, nephew's grandson kind of situation. Right. It was,
yes.
It was I didn't realize whenever I was doing that job, I was 30 years old. I looked all of 22. I didn't have the hair or the beard yet. And also I wasn't really settled as a professional, I was just out there trying to make some money, and keep things moving and stuff like that. So, if there's a way to communicate with other people who are on the level that lets them know that you're on the level. And I talk about this in my coaching and teaching world, because if you're doing outreach to people and you're trying to get a meeting, if you can't communicate that you're on the level, the default assumption is that you're not even worth being talked to.
Well, and Rooster, let's talk a little bit about him, because he's the old grizzled veteran, right? Sure. He's that old grizzled veteran sales guy who shows up with the rumpled suit. He's got a 2-day old, whatever beard.
Mhm.
He smells vaguely of the last beer he drank. You've run across this guy, but he walks into the room and he closes. And then he
Yeah.
walks out and he says, "You have a good day." And he goes right back to his hotel bar and posts up there, like in Glengarry Glen Ross, greatest sales film ever made, and has another drink with Jack Lemmon. Complains about how hard sales is, right?
Yeah.
And you're sitting there and you're going, I don't like Matt Damon in Ocean's, I think it was Ocean's 12. When he walked in and he insulted the I always think about this scene where he walks in and he insults the whatever, whoever it is that Brad Pitt and George Clooney are trying to scam and about their daughter and something, and he walks out and Brad Pitt and George Clooney are messing with him and they go, "You just insulted his daughter." "Yeah, blah blah blah, blah. You said this." And "Yeah, you said that." And this, of course, the two grizzled veterans screwing with the rookie. And Matt Damon goes, "I have no idea what just happened there."
Yes. That is every person after a cold calling session.
You're right.
You
And
know?
Rooster knows what happened there. He knows exactly what he knows. Let's see. Rooster knows exactly what's going to happen to the Choctaw Nation. He knows exactly how hard it is to go get Tom Chaney, or Chelmsford, by the way, played in the Ethan Coen film by Josh Brolin, in a great, not a great role. I don't think they gave him enough to work, or not
Yeah,
Josh
it's not.
Brolin. Yeah, it was Josh Brolin. Yeah,
Yeah,
didn't give
it was
him enough
Josh
to work
Brolin.
with. Yep,
Didn't give him nearly enough to work with, right?
not
Like
nearly enough.
that dude is an amazing actor, right? And I had forgotten who played him in the newer one, right? Because in
Yeah,
the old movie, not a big part.
yeah,
You
no,
could have walked an extra on and given him a SAG card,
yep.
in for that performance. But Brolin, I was expecting a lot, and it just kind of seemed like he was, trying way too hard to play a half wit because there wasn't really enough to really do anything else. But man, the other part is like as a culture,
Mm-hmm.
we do spend a lot more time on a hold on, let me say this the right way, on a path of education. Might not be correct, might not be valid, but we're connected a lot more to sources of knowledge, good,
Yes,
bad, or otherwise, than people were back then, right? So whenever
right.
it's so funny in the book when he's lamenting and talking
Mm-hmm.
about how nothing goes his way, right?
That's right.
And the auctioneer does the same thing. It's so funny because Mattie in the book, she keeps running into these people who are just victims of uncontrollable situations. And
Yes.
she's such a force of nature. It creates this really interesting contrast, right? Now,
Oh, and by
there's
the
a
way, the
lot to be
original,
said. Yeah.
sorry, pardon me, the original Tom Chaney, I forgot about it and then I had to look on the back. Robert Duvall. Or no, Robert Duvall played Lucky Ned Pepper. Tom Chaney was played by, I think it was Strother Martin, if I remember correctly. I think that was
I,
the guy who
I have no
who
idea who
played
that
it.
is.
Right.
Dennis Hopper's in that movie as well.
Yes. Right. Yes. When they're shooting the two guys over the soft key and all. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah.
I'd forgotten that he was in that movie, and then I was watching the credits, and I was
Yep.
like, Dennis Hopper? That's crazy.
Well, and Lucky Ned Pepper was such, well, anyway, no, sorry. You're talking about Josh Brolin, talking about pursuing education.
Mhm.
Um, I think that, and to the larger point, Cogburn knows all these things, right? He
Yeah.
knows all of the stuff, and he knows it so well that he can sleep in a bed, and both Wayne and Bridges got this. He can sleep in a bed that's broken down, shoot a rat, live with a Chinese immigrant, and get up and go do his stuff anyway. Now, there's this section in the book which is kind of touched on in the original film, and then it's totally completely abandoned in the Ethan Coen version, where Mattie Ross does his does
His
does his
books.
paper,
Yeah,
does
his
his books
figuring.
basically,
His his figuring, if you will.
figuring.
And he's like making it up on the spot. Oh, we'll change it to this person because yeah, I think I shot that guy once, kind of thing. And like playing fast and loose with your expense reports, is such like
Right.
it's such a sales thing,
It's
right?
such a
Like,
sales
oh,
thing.
like we can expense this thing, and then it gets like snapped out the half cord, and then you're trying to justify why you spent the money. Like, oh man, I've been on both sides of that, honestly.
Well, and he's out in the middle of nowhere. No one
Mhm.
from back east knows. And this is the other thing. I'm fascinated with the Old West for a number of different reasons, but one of the biggest ones is, and you and I both, you mentioned, both you and I both live in Texas. Texas is so big that there are parts of Texas that I don't even know where the heck they are.
Yeah.
And I live here, much less living on the East Coast. It's another universe out here. And that's the brilliance of, and I always talk about, well, not always, but one of the things I'll talk about sometimes around this area is Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny gets crapped on a lot these days as an excuse for colonialism, racism, sexism, bigotry, patriarchy, da 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 da. Okay, but Manifest Destiny was also Rooster Cogburn making it up as he was going along and ensuring that a variation of civilization was allowed to continue so that people like the guy in Little House on the Prairie who's just trying to live can actually live there, actually live there and actually like make a living. Right now, were there Indians there? Should we now have taken over their land? For sure. Should we have done a better deal? For sure. I'll caveat all of that if you will caveat to me that no one back east knew what the hell was going on.
Oh man, like
didn't have a clue.
I'm from
Sign
Texas.
the expense sheets and pay Rooster.
Yeah. Like I've lived here my entire life, and until I joined the military and went to Georgia, realizing just how different it is. For people on the coasts, right? We had a particularly heated moment to where a white guy who's from Seattle, Washington, right? Very, very not the South. Says to an African American fellow that he looks a little bit like a monkey, and he has no idea about the weight of that term because he was just giving the guy crap. You know, he wasn't making a bigger judgment call. But man, I've never seen sides chosen so quickly, right? Amongst a group of guys that are all supposed to be on the same side, you know? And it's, you know, he has no knowledge about that. But to your point, there's cities in this state that we both lived in that if you walked into the biggest hub of commerce in that city, you would probably be looked at just like you would have 100 years ago if you'd walked into that situation. And the same thing, like it's still there, you know, and some people are choosing to create it for themselves, which is a whole other conversation. But
well, and that's a whole other, that's a little bit, that's a little bit beyond where we need to.
That's a whole other podcast, probably.
That's a whole other episode. But I think that LaBeouf represents that civilization too. He represents that civilizing force, but it's a civilizing force that's cocksure and arrogant, whereas Rooster Cogburn is the civilizing force that knows, kind of like John Wayne in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, another great film where, you know, Jimmy Stewart is going to bring the law book and none of that matters in the particular situation.
We used to love that. I think that is the 90s and 80s kind of like time period, right? You know, and so that's why people love Clint Eastwood and John, you know, in these kind of movies, to where it's about the street smart guy telling the book smart people that they don't really know what it's like and stuff like this. But man, you know, it's so easy to just look at that, you know, plot device and be like, oh yeah, right. Some people are bad. Know? Some people need a shorter leash, right? They don't need the you know, the loudspeaker of social media. They don't need all of that stuff, right? And I like what you said that he doesn't tweet. I appreciate that. You know, he doesn't do any of these things.
He doesn't do any of that.
I think that's
Portis didn't care about any of that. Portis didn't care about any of that. He cared about.
He just wanted to write. He just wanted to share his stories. It, like, the way that I talk about it now with people is like, he was fine making art.
Yeah. And
I've shifted a lot on this, because in the beginning I was very much kind of, why doesn't my stuff get more of a push and all this other stuff? And why is everyone holding me down and all this other stuff, right? Part of it I was choosing to because of how I want to talk about the work, right? But man, I think that part of it is it's tied to like so much of the other stuff, right?
Mhm.
How are you doing that work? And
Mhm.
is it unpopular because it's unpopular, or is it unpopular because you're wrong? You know,
Right.
one of the things that I talk about with people is like, okay, if no one likes the girl you're dating, nobody, she's probably not great, right? And you should probably, but you can't tell your friend that
No,
when you're dating,
no,
right?
no.
And but like afterward, told you, bro, told you. Everyone tried to
Right.
tell you, man.
Everybody knew.
You're the only one who didn't get it,
Yeah.
you know.
Right. Right.
So there is that thing of like, are you unpopular because you take unpopular stances? Are you unpopular because you're actually like not on the level?
Well, and Mattie, to turn back to her for just a second, she's narrating this book and looking back as a middle-aged woman,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you would think that that moralism would be softened over the course of time, because that's what we say. People get older, their perspectives become more nuanced, they get to be a little bit more whatever, softened, the edges round off, right?
Yep.
But not, no, not Mattie Ross. Like
And
she
I think,
locked in, and she was uncompromising. And the thing that we sort of skated around it, and now we need to actually hit it.
yeah,
The thing that made her uncompromising was her religion. It was her Christian
yep.
religion. And that's the other thing that makes this book an anachronism. And I worry that over the course, not worry, I wonder if in 50 years anybody will remember Charles Portis. They'll remember the movie, probably.
For
But
sure.
in the book, I doubt it. I don't think anybody's going to read it in 50 years. If because we now live in a, for good, better, or for good or bad, we now live in a post-Christian America. We do. We live in a world where the thin veneer of cultural Christianity that used to bind people together, even people who didn't believe, they would at least nod to cultural Christianity. They would at least say, yeah, the 10 Commandments, our laws are based on that. That's cool. We're way the heck away from that now. And I think the further and further we get away from that, the more and more we're going to struggle with meaning. We talked a lot about meaning on this podcast last year, a lot, because I firmly believe that without the Christian underpinnings, because I'm a partisan for Christianity, I say this at least once an episode. That's my thing. Um, that underpinning for me, is the cornerstone in Western civilization. It's the thing that if you pull that sucker out, the whole thing falls down. Because what are you going to appeal to? Like, maybe it is okay for me to eat my neighbor if my morality and their morality, if morality is just relative, then I can just eat my neighbor, right? Like, there's not a problem. There's no issue there.
Man, I have a very polarizing opinion to you on this because I am not a spiritual person at all. I
Sure.
am not
Yeah.
religious, right? I spent my
Yeah.
time doing Southern Baptist and then realized that I got tired of like constantly being sold, right?
Sure.
That's what it
Okay.
felt like,
Yeah.
lots of pressure and don't you want it, blah blah blah. Why can't you just believe,
Why can't you just
right?
sign up for Jesus today?
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Sure. Okay.
I know a couple of really cool people that I knew during this time. And because of these interactions with them, my perception of them is colored because while I'm sure they're great people in and of themselves, it just felt like a sales press
Pitch.
the entire
Yeah.
time. And I hate the conversation of like, well, if you're not religious, you don't really have any morals, right? Because a lot of people go there and it's like way too polarizing of a situation. Because
I won't say you don't have any morals. I would say, if you're not religious, where is your moral bedrock then?
that's a good point, right?
Where
And
does it
so
lie?
so important distinction, right? Like I'm not trying to say that you were saying this, but
Sure,
people
sure.
have asked
Yeah.
me this question before. Well, John, if you're not religious, where do your morals come from? The laws,
Okay. Yeah.
the laws have a big part of it. And now that I'm older and I've done the kung fu path, right,
Mm-hmm.
to instructorship, and now like I try to follow stoicism, and like
Mm-hmm.
I have a guide and a compass. Now, what's
Mm-hmm.
hilarious is like just last week, I was talking to someone about this thing on Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of got a little high and mighty around the idea that, like, hey, if it's not attached to God, you're just wasting your time. And it's like, cool, we can't have conversations anymore,
Mm-hmm.
at least not about this.
Mm-hmm.
He works in the same space, right? So we can refer back and forth, but after being told that my work on my own philosophies doesn't matter because it's not attached to an idol that he sees absolutism in, you
Okay.
know, like, why would I go back to that conversation with that person ever
Sure.
again in the future, right? Because I don't expect anyone to shift in their thinking to my way, but I do expect to be treated as an adult who has some thought and some intention in how I go about making my decisions. So
Now
whenever
that's
people just kind of backlash with like, well, if you just read the Bible or if you just went to church, you wouldn't have to, you wouldn't have, it's like, no, I would still be doing this work, even if I was thinking in that way, because, the work in itself is important. Now, the place that I've come to, because there for a while I was fairly vocal uh, about my lack of faith, if you will.
mm-hmm.
And now the place that I've gotten to is you look at the positives in all of these areas, whether it's Stoicism or Christianity or Buddhism or anything else like this, and you look at the negatives, and it's alarming
Mm-hmm.
how much they line up of being consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the trappings and the labels and some of the practices are going to be very, very different, but
Mm-hmm.
the structure of these things is more aligned than it's not,
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I had not read all the philosophy stuff and not been in a role that is so focused around performance and your mindset and your behaviors and your attitudes around it, I think I'd be a lot more probably stuck. But
Mm-hmm.
I've had sales managers and sales leaders tell me, "Hey, we've already hit our goal on that one. Go tell them that we're out so that way they'll buy this one." I've had people try to get me to go lie on their behalf so that way I can hit a number for them. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't do that, right? And then it's like, well, John, you should do what I tell you to. No, man, sorry, I'm not going to compromise myself for your goals. And
And that's the thing you see with Mattie Ross.
yeah,
That's the thing I was getting to, is her uncompromisingness comes from her religious bedrock.
yeah,
Your uncompromisingness comes from your exploration of philosophies and worldviews, and sort of cobbling that together. And we talked about this a little bit in the episode that we just did on Malcolm X, because Malcolm X, his entire worldview came from Islam.
yep,
And it was interesting. We pointed out on that episode that he was converted to Islam in prison in the 1950s when he was serving an 8 to 10 year bid. Came out, started talking, hooked up with Elijah Muhammad, hooked up with the Nation of Islam. Changed his name to Malcolm X from Malcolm Little. And then during the course of time between the time he got out of prison and his assassination in the mid 1960s, he actually traveled to Mecca and went on the pilgrimage, right? Came back and was changed because he saw the differences between what they were doing in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, with their version of Islam, and what we were doing here, or what the black nationalists were doing here with the Nation of Islam version of Islam. And he saw the cracks in the facade,
in the veneer, yeah,
in the veneer,
absolutely.
right? And the point that we made on the podcast, and this is where I thought you were going to struggle with the book the most. And this is where I think most folks will struggle with the book, particularly in, again, a post-Christian, postmodern era. I genuinely think we're there. I think we've been there for minimum 10 years, probably max 15, for a whole variety of cultural and social reasons that are way too deep to get into right now.
Do you quantify, like, how? Okay, you say that statement, right?
Yeah.
And then
Mm-hmm.
the person that I am,
yeah.
What illustrates that? Like if
Gosh.
we went and we tried to do a quantified analysis, would that mean
Yeah.
that more than half of our nation is not?
I will actually give you a statistic here.
Please.
83 folks were surveyed, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago. Only 17% of the sample survey, and I can't remember how big the sample survey was, but only 17% of the survey attended church more than once a month. So 83% of that sample attends church once a month or zero, and still calls themselves Christian. I don't think you can effectively engage in that space without some more buttressing of the belief system. Now on the backside of that, on the backside of that too, I'll also say this is the other data point. On the backside of that, we saw this with post-COVID. the numbers of churches that are declining in membership, and we don't see it in Texas. So you have to go.
Oh, of course.
Right. You have to go outside of Texas to see this.
Yeah. The mega church. Come down to Texas, guys.
Right. Come down to Texas, guys. But if you go on I lived in the East Coast I lived in the East Coast to the Northeast for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
The number of mega churches there, the concept doesn't exist.
So when you say the line that you said,
yeah,
the bigger concern is you have people, if I'm way off base, please correct me.
Sure.
The major concern is you have people going around saying that they're making decisions based upon Christianity, but they're not steeped enough actually in the knowledge, the values, the morals to really know whether or not their actions would line up with that, but they're kind of hiding.
For sure.
So is that the concern?
That's the concern.
Okay, yeah, so it's not that you think that people like need to go to church.
No, I'm not saying that.
If you're going to go out and be like, "Hey, I'm making decisions from a biblical stance," you need to be in church.
Yeah, I would think that would be helpful. Yeah, probably.
I mean, here's the thing,
I think that would be helpful, actually.
Yeah, like we're both martial artists, and we both have like shifted our lanes, right? And while I still do my forms and everything else like this, it would be absurd for both of us to sit here and be like, you know what, I'm just as good in my old art as I am in like the stuff I'm working on now, because you're not putting in the practice, you're not putting in the work, and rust accumulates on anything.
You're not showing up at the dojo. I'm not showing up at the studio to do my old art.
Yep. And if you're not running forums and figuring it out and building a community for yourself, those skills are decaying. Just like, if I stopped taking my own calls and setting my own meetings and everything, eventually I would become one of these people that I don't like. Right?
Exactly.
Which is why I will always have a lane of either setting my own meetings, so I'm attached to that work and I know how much it sucks whenever it doesn't go your way, or eventually I will be hopefully selling at a place to where my stuff has got a little bit of growth to it, like not like a household name, but one of the bigger names. But at that point, what I would like to do is, sell under like a pen name, right? So that way I can still come on, but not. There's this one video that just drives me crazy where it's a Grant Cardone video, right? And he walks in and someone's on a call, and Grant Cardone just he's like, "Hey, you on a call?" He just grabs it. He's like, "Yeah, this is Grant," and then closes the deal. And everyone's like, "Yeah." It's his name on the entire sign. If he can't close that deal, that would be the problem, right? Like all of this stuff around authority and content and everything else like this, like leads to a place to where you're making it easier to be heard, But by that same token, Grant has that guy and everyone else who's selling on their authority and their name and their prestige absolutely is as disconnected from what it actually takes to be a salesperson in the day-to-day as these leaders who were looking at data points all day in Salesforce and HubSpot and wanting to tell the salesperson, "Hey, you know what? We'd really like you to like improve your close rate a little bit," but not give him any information or knowledge on how to do that.
You said the word there, authority. That's the word I've been leading into. Mattie Ross takes her authority from the Bible and from her biblical belief. Grant Cardone takes his authority from Grant Cardone. Although recently I heard he's a Scientologist. I did not know that. That was an interesting.
There's a lot of people in the coaching space who are pushing Scientology with like their own labels. Like it's really more common than you would think that it would be. I know a mega coach who it's Scientology rebranded under his own stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did not know that. Thank you for that data point. I'll put that in the back of my head and chew on that for a little bit. But Grant Cardone is selling off of I'm Grant Cardone. Okay. Yep. That's where he's getting his authority from. Where are we? The thing for leaders is, from where does your authority come? And a guy like Malcolm X spoke with moral authority in questioning the United States during the civil rights struggle because he came from a position of moral authority based on his religion.
Yep.
Mattie Ross came from a position of moral authority based on her religion. And by the way, as a female character in literature, I rank her as up there with Wendy and Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, and most particularly Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Very rarely do you have a woman. I mean, think about The Wizard of Oz. I love this movie because everything moves in The Wizard of Oz because of something Dorothy does.
That's really interesting.
Same thing in True Grit. The forward motion of the novel is because of Mattie Ross.
You know, not to be the sales guy, and that when you're a sales guy, everything's a sales opportunity, but you know, most of them are. Um, as I'm reading this book and I'm seeing her run over, right, certain people, right?
Oh yeah.
And then, you know, she tries to run over Rooster and it doesn't work.
No.
Right. They eventually become kind of collaborative in their negotiations. Right. And it's so funny because I feel like Mattie in most of her conversations can push people around just like most people can do in a B2C type sale, right? They're not aware. They don't do this a lot. It's easy to manipulate them and talk them into the things and force the value perceptions and stuff like that. And so then you think like, oh my gosh, I can sell B2B. And then you go and you meet Rooster Cogburn and you try to move him with your ideas and your agendas, and it just doesn't work. And that's what like selling B2B is. These people are savvy. They've been here before. They have had more of these conversations than you have. And you're just going to show up and be like, is it a question of time or value? And think it's going to get heard well. That's not how this works. You know, they have more authority than you do in those situations. And so you can't, you know, there's a lot of talk about framing and forcing authority and taking authority away and everything else like this, but you fundamentally can't put authority on someone who has real authority and isn't concerned.
Not only that, and I've been selling B2B my entire training career. All I do is sell B2B. I mean, I've done projects where I've sold B2C before, and it's to me, it's so easy. My God, it's easy to go backward.
If they come to the meeting, you're good.
Oh,
right. Whereas in B2B, like if they come to the meeting, great. They got an opportunity to take a break from the real actual work. It doesn't mean they're invested. Doesn't mean there's aware of a problem. It doesn't mean that they see you as someone who can help them or anything else like this. They just were like, well, I don't want to do cold calls, so let's go to the webinar. And then you got some poor sales guy over there, like telling everyone, I got one. No, you don't. You don't have anything.
You got nothing.
You got someone who's avoidant of the work, and they're hanging out with you, so that way you can be avoidant of your prospecting. Congratulations, we're all winning.
You got 4 more meetings. That's what you, actually no, it's not 4 more. You got 4 months more of meetings. Yes. That's what you got.
and then a disappear into the Ninja Vanish smoke.
Into the Ninja Vanish smoke. I had that actually had that happen to me like 2 weeks ago. Disappeared into the Ninja smoke. I was like, well, okay.
I got 2 big no's last week, right? And I think that this is an important point. If you are a leader, if you're in a leader shop, you have to talk about that it still happens to you, right? You know, because people are like, well, John, you don't get what it's, you want to talk about how I don't get it? I can show you my DMs where like I booked on a wrong thing and a guy wanted to like try to sue me because I booked on his free discovery and not like, hey, chat with us kind of thing. Like when you're rooted, and this is the part that I love about the book, and I don't think anyone else is going to get this point except for maybe you. When you are rooted, everyone else moves.
Yes.
And if you are not rooted, and this is what Seneca talks about, you're not going to find yourself in the crowd. And until you do find yourself, the crowd is the last place you need to be hanging out at. And once you do find yourself, you know where you don't want to be? The crowd.
The crowd.
Right? Because you ruined it for everyone else. You're the poker player who's read one book and understands all the math in play, and everyone else is like, man, can you believe how lucky that guy is? You're the sales guy who has done hundreds of thousands of calls and conversations, and then whenever someone is like, well, we can meet if you're cheaper, and you realize that's not worth going to. That's actual practiced authority and knowledge and stuff like that, as opposed to, you know, trying to cultivate hope, right? When you're a revenue person and you're cultivating hope, you're just setting yourself up to fail and get fired. And you have to be no nonsense. You have to be, I'm going to push as hard as I think that I need to push, and then we'll make adjustments. And I love how they show that in the book, right? I think they do a better job of that in the second movie than they do the first one, right? Of her being thoughtful and strategic and intentional and stuff like that. Because it's not all hard talk. She's working towards a goal. She knows how much money she wants from him for this entire situation, which is allowing her to have that, no, my lawyer, J. Noble Daggett, would not be happy with me accepting anything less than $300.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, like it's that having a clear goal, being practiced, and then also running wild with that authority, whether it's actually true and validated or whether, you know, the fake it till you make it stuff of sales and marketing and entrepreneurship, like kind of bothers me because like people will just lie to try to get a deal and stuff like that. But on the other side of it, you do kind of have to like drink your own Kool-Aid a little bit, right? If you're putting
Yeah.
yourself out there and hanging a shingle, you're supposed to think you're good enough, right? You go to a restaurant from a chef.
Well, and you're supposed to be able to, no, not even that. I'll frame it this way. I tell young entrepreneurs, um, the first sale, I actually told this to somebody last week, the first sale you have to do, I don't care if it's B2C, B2B, whatever your business is, that's almost irrelevancy. The first sale you have to do is your partner. And you've already talked about this before on the podcast, but your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, whatever situation you got going on, that's the first husband, whatever, that's the first sale you've got to do. If you can't close that, don't bother with your project. Because the dynamic at your house is going to be a constant distraction, and you're going to be, you talked about this earlier, you're going to be going to your business to solve all the games that you have to play, or to solve all the puzzles that you have to play, and you're going to wind up hiding in there because, or even worse, you're going to be hijacked by that business, which is even worse. And now, yeah, you have $100 million company, but for
you
what?
hate it. You hate it. You hate your clients. You hate the team. Like, I was talking to someone about this because he's like, man, I got a great podcast idea. I was like, great. What's your goal? And he goes, well, to make the podcast. I was like, great, start. You don't need anything else. Start.
Yep.
And he was like, and when you put in poker, this is called putting someone to a decision. Mm-hmm. Right. And there's an allegory in sales that you need to put people to decisions. Hey, you don't want this, I'm leaving. That's putting it to a decision in the form of a takeaway, kind of situation. And so the guy goes, well, I said, okay, what happens if you make 100 episodes and you don't make any money? He goes, that would be fine. I said, cool, start. What are you waiting on? You know, just do the Jocko thing. You don't need anything. You need conversations. Go.
That's it.
And he goes, well, as much as I'd be okay doing that, I'd still rather do the show that makes a bunch of money. And I'm like, cool, like you're not really clear on what's important then, right? So anything that, a shiny object syndrome that could have a little glint to it is going to pull your focus from the thing because you're not sure that it has it over here. And that's okay as long as your goals are aligned with the idea that you're not making art, because art you make for yourself and the individuals that will appreciate it. You are making a business-focused podcast, which means your decision trees are going to be fundamentally different.
Back to the book for just a moment.
Yeah, sorry, we get super tangent. Like,
we
this
do.
is my
we
favorite
do.
conversation. I've been making notes. I've been practicing myself of like making sure we talked about some things because there for a while I was trying to become my version of Mattie, this person, right? Whenever I first met my sales coach and I found out who I was and started doing assessments and on a path of self-awareness, I realized that I do have this little nurturing aspect to me, right? And then I decided, you know what, I'm going to murder this person so that way I can be all business, brass tacks type, And I spent probably 4 or 5 years trying to like kind of destroy that side of myself in the form of being more business-like. And now finally I can turn and I can face that and appreciate that it does make me different. It does make me like want to come onto this conversation and talk about a book that no one is reading and hasn't read for a very long time during the workday, because business John would be like, no, more outreach, more meetings and everything else like that. So I think it's easy when people see that Mattie character, right? And they either turn away or they turn to it. It's important to know that depending upon the work that you're doing and your pattern and precedent and path, Mattie was never in a situation where she didn't have that authority. So then when it came to people who didn't know who she was, it was already there. But I like the thing that you said, you have to go sell your partner on it first. I think you actually have to sell yourself on it first, because if you're not yourself sold on the fact that I am enough, my opinions and my knowledge and my experience is enough for you to pay me on my own merit at my own rate, you're not going to sell your partner on it, and you're not going to sell anybody else on it either. It's going to be a lot of maybes and a whole lot of, smoke screens, which is what we call them in sales.
No, that's a good point. And there's a line in Braveheart. Man, we're brilliant all the movie references today. There's a line in Braveheart where oh gosh, I can't remember the character, but it's the old syphilitic old man that's in the house,
I don't remember his name either.
Yeah, I don't remember. It doesn't. Robert the Bruce's father. That's who it was. And Robert the Bruce is like, I want to go off with, basically, I want to go off with Braveheart. I want to go off with Mel Gibson because he fights and he's uncompromising. And the father goes, yeah, it's easy to admire uncompromising men, but you have been passed land and title because you compromise. And when I was 15, maybe, and saw that movie, I was like, I said it. I remember I said inside myself, yeah, I'm going to go off and be uncompromising. I'm going to be 45 this year, kids. I guess I might as well publicly announce that. Oof, never thought I would say that out loud. And after 30 years, I see Robert the Bruce's father's point.
Same.
Now, with that being said, I believe that sometimes compromise, and I've said this in a couple of different podcast episodes, I think in America, we don't know how to hit the center of the target on much of anything, politically, culturally, socially. We swing wildly back and forth, and we have for numbers of years. That might actually just be part of our national character. It seems to be such a thing with us, right?
We all waffle a bit.
Oh my God, we're all over the place. We want to have it all ways and both ways and up and down and side to side. And maybe that's because of the conceit in the creed of freedom that just so runs through our national documents and in our national character. Okay. Freedom to engage in hedonic pleasure, but also freedom to be accountable and responsible and be locked in like Mattie Ross. Okay. And by the way, we see this, by the way, in the next part of the book, when she hooks up with, or not hooks up, but when they run across the ambush, and they meet Quincy and Moon and those kinds of guys, right? Because so those are sort of that little group waiting for Ned Pepper is sort of representative of, I think that was Charles Portis's dig at the 1960s radicals, actually. Like you're gonna be these people who are gonna like just wait and change the world.
Well, like he doesn't like hippies.
Watch this. Yeah, no, he does not like hippies.
They're kind of the hippies of that book, right? Because they're not part of like normal society with like the marshals and everything, but right. They're not like really bad because they're still young. They've not like actually turned to a life of crime yet. I had not really thought about that, but that really is kind of the first part in the book to where her momentum in and of itself is not enough for things to make sense.
Right. And they aren't convinced in any kind of way that her momentum has any authority whatsoever. Yeah. And it's really interesting because I'm going to frame it this way, regardless of what you may think of what has happened over the last 4 years since COVID. Mm-hmm. One of the more interesting responses by Americans, and I really didn't think, I knew there was going to be a slice of America that would do this, but I didn't realize what the percentages would be. The numbers is always the issue, right? Mm-hmm. What are the numbers, right? I didn't realize that there was a sizable chunk of Americans who were just going to pull a Rooster Cogburn or we'll use Rooster Cogburn, who were just going to pull a Rooster Cogburn and go, those guys back east don't know what they're doing. We're going to do whatever the hell we want. And I didn't, because that's also part of that freedom piece. That's part of the slice. It's all embedded in there. And it comes from, honestly, we talked about this last year on the podcast with DeRollo Nixon. We were talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. So the person who was the leading anti-federalist charge was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry didn't trust the Founding Fathers. He was actually invited to go to the Constitutional Convention. This is an interesting historical thing. He was invited to go to the Constitutional Convention by Thomas Jefferson because Thomas Jefferson couldn't go because he was over in France.
Mm-hmm.
And Patrick Henry wouldn't go because he, quote unquote, smelled a rat. And by the way, that's the anarcho-libertarian strain in America. And we talked about it on the podcast, DeRollo and I. And that's the kind of people who go up into the Kentucky mountains and you leave them alone. Just leave them alone. Just leave those people alone, right? They're bat crap crazy sometimes. Yep. They don't, their principles don't line up with logic or reality, and they will all fight their cousins. And God help you if you go and you turn up that hornet's nest.
Yep.
Because then they'll all turn and start fighting you.
Yep.
And I thought that strain around COVID had actually been bred out of Americans. And I
Oh
was
man.
shocked to discover that it was still there because to me, from my perspective, from where I'm sitting, that's been buried for a while, or it hasn't been pushed hard enough. It wasn't really pushed hard enough in the 80s or in the 90s because everybody was getting rich. And then in the early 2000s, you saw a little bit of it start to show up in, ironically enough, Occupy Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it first started to show up. And then Occupy Wall Street gradually floated over to being the Tea Party, which gradually floated over into some other things that we're experiencing politically in our culture right now. And by the way, that's a strain that unites the anarcho-libertarian right and the socialist anarchist left. Both share the same DNA in our country. And that's really weird for people to see. And so you look at Mattie Ross and you look at her engaging with the folks in the house, Quincy and Moon and all of that, and they're it's the 1960s version of that sort of libertarian anarcho. We're just going to kind of do our thing, and we're just going to kind of ignore you. And if you just go away and leave us alone, we're going to eat our soft key and you can just leave. And
we're going to be fine.
We're going to be fine. And Rooster Cogburn has nothing for any of that. He's like, no, I'm not. Just no. You got to play. Just no.
Yeah.
And then Ned Pepper shows up, which ties into something that I said last year, which is, okay, you're basing your meaning on external authorities. That's fine. Go ahead, base your meaning on external authorities. What are you going to do? And we looked at this with Crime and Punishment, and we looked at this also with the Gulag Archipelago. What are you going to do when genuine evil shows up? Because it always does eventually.
And like I think that they do a better version of this in the second movie.
Yes.
Mr. Cogburn and Lucky Ned Pepper are the same person, just a couple of different coin flips and decisions gone the other way.
Right.
And then you have Mattie who's righteous, right? I mean, she's almost like the person who you ask, like, hey, is it wrong to steal bread to feed your family? And they've never been hungry before. Right. So of course it doesn't make any sense. You've never like actually had to be put to that situation, you know? So it's this like philosophical knowledge that she keeps running into around the whole thing. But in the second book, you know, like Ned is as practiced and as competent as Rooster. Like that ain't gonna fly. You got 5 minutes. Get out of here. And he's like, we're gonna need longer than 5 minutes. He's like, you better get going. And he goes, I'll lead him astray, I think, for like 6 hours. He's like, nah. Like he knows where he is. He like they're the same character, just with a black hat and a white hat.
Right. And that also is part of the dynamic of the I think that's part of the dynamic of the 1960s. It's playing underneath this.
Interesting. Okay.
Underneath this novel, and then fundamentally underneath the first film. Less so underneath the second film, only because, and this gets back to my assertion about, you know, being post-Christian. I think we've kind of merged and muddled, and this has happened over 20 years, by the way. We've kind of merged and muddled our meanings together, and we've kind of like made it we'll all just be a soup kind of thing. And then when a person like Mattie shows up that says, no, we're not going to be a soup, now you're the nail that's sticking up that's going to get hammered down.
Yep.
And you know, again, religion is the easy place to make this, but you can also, honestly,
we're speaking like well in the future. So all these things have kind of come true, that you can't just like go out and do whatever. So, you know, we're kind of like speaking like, hey, gravity works, when we already know that gravity is like very well established, right? But like, she's going around, right? And like in period, going around telling people that they need to be law-abiding citizens when no one around them is abiding by any laws. And there's no real pressure to do so because you're days and days away from a lawman. Right.
Well, like the speeches that the guys give who get hung, right at the beginning when she first shows up to Fort Smith, right? She goes through a hanging,
and they don't have the speeches in the first movie, which I thought was like a huge bummer. So the other part, two things that I want to make sure we talk about. Can we talk about the weirdness of the random hanging person in the middle of the forest in the second one?
Yes.
That was weird to me. And then you said something else that I think is very interesting. My wife made this comment that the John Wayne is kind of Disney-fied, the movie, right? Because like on the exit,
Okay.
she's just talking to him and he runs off with the horse and jumps the fence and everything else like this, right? Whereas like in the book, right, and she doesn't lose her arm either,
Right. No,
right?
she doesn't. Yeah.
I think it would be very interesting. I think she is still that person, much, much older, because of the trauma of in the life change of that injury, right? And then I'm sure she carried around all, oh yeah, you want to make fun of me because I lost, you know what I lost this arm doing? And then she's as bad as every veteran who I've ever met. I'm also a veteran, so don't come at me. Like who wants to like go around wearing shirts that say "Don't mistake my kindness for weakness" is like some sort of weird billboard that you're tough.
Right.
Like, good Lord, put it down, go find something else. But like I think the second book does or the second movie does a better job of kind of showing that staunchness of how it plays out. But I think it plays out because of the trauma of the injury and the righteousness that comes forward after a big injury like that.
So I think the application to leadership is this. I think that at a certain point, you have to become whole, right? You have to bring all the disparate parts of yourself together, right? That's a lifetime process. And one of the things that the second film shows, and the book too, is the struggle that Mattie had to kind of unite and negotiate all those pieces of her.
Yep. I never married. I never had time for it.
Right.
And
I
how she
didn't
talks about it at the end of it.
exactly. People wanted my money, men wanted my money, and I wasn't interested in any of that. Now, by the way, you could read that through a feminist lens.
Oh, you can read that through a sales lens. John, we don't talk to salespeople here. You can fill out the bid and then we can't even have a conversation about what you're really looking for. Absolutely not, John. We don't talk to salespeople before the decision step. Like,
right.
because you just want to sell me. No, I'm
Right.
trying to figure out if I can actually help you or not. But when
Right.
you want to see it as a sales conversation or a guy who wants to take your money, it's going to have a remarkably, like, very consistent effect, like showing up that way.
Oh yeah.
Oh
Oh
yeah,
yeah. And you shouldn't be
for it and then
surprised.
imposing it.
Yeah, you shouldn't be
Oh,
surprised that it's showing up that way.
yeah.
Whereas in the first movie, I find it interesting that your wife said Disney-fied. Um, I would say the thing that was missing in the Coen film is the thing that makes the original Hal Wallace production probably more loved, and it's this sense of humor. I think that's one of the big things with the Ethan Coen film. The humor was kind of drained from it, like the Roger Deakins photography. And Roger Deakins is a great cinematographer, but everything that he shoots for the Coen brothers is drained of color. Like everything is drained of color.
Okay.
And so I think that sense of humor, and I think that was missed, by the way, because the Portis is writing this tongue in cheek. He actually loves these people.
Yeah.
And he wants you to laugh at them and laugh with them. And he wants it to be obviously a ride. He wants there to be some humor in there. You know, he kind of knows, he's kind of giving you the nudge and the wink about the morality with Mattie. And, you know, he's putting her in these kinds of situations. You don't get any of that. The Coens take it dead serious.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Hal Wallace production with John Wayne, yes, you're too old and too fat to be jumping fences. By the way, we used to say this all the time. We had in college, this is one of my college buddies. He was a smoker from Tennessee, and I've never talked about him on the podcast before, but man smoked like a friggin' chimney, and he loved old westerns. He loved all of them, and he knew obscure westerns that I didn't even know about, and I thought I had like deep film knowledge. And so we were talking about True Grit one time, and we're standing outside, and this is in northern Minnesota, and it's cold, and he's smoking, of course, because that's what he does. And I said something to him, like something to the effect of, it's guys messing around with other guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
I said something to him like, you're too old and too fat to be running around out here smoking. and he literally pulls the cigarette out of his mouth. He blows the cigarette smoke all over the place. He goes, well, come by and see a fat old man sometime. And he just walks away.
That's amazing. Like, it's so funny.
Amazing.
It's so funny because I think there is this weirdness of John Wayne out of time, right?
Right.
He's a big personality, he's a big person, but like in the movie, like he doesn't seem so old. Like that was how most people were back then, right? Like,
Right.
like they're not going to the gym, like the gym is your regular chores,
They,
and so
if every ad in magazines was either whiskey, cigarettes, or cars with big fins. If you look at the magazines from like nineteen
yeah,
fifty five to like 1975, that's
yeah,
it. That's all people did
yeah.
in America, apparently.
Live the lifestyle because like, hey, no consequences for any of these actions. You're going to
Hey,
be just fine.
and David Ogilvy will write all of the copy underneath all of those ads.
Yes, he will. Absolutely, he will. But like in the newer one, I feel like they did a better job of showing Bridges like kind of later in life, kind of
Mhm.
washed out and stuff like that. I think the book does a really better job of kind of showing in a really interesting way some of the insights of his backstory about like talking about how all the buffalo are gone, which, as
Yeah.
a guy who really likes buffalo and has one tattooed on his arm, I was like, oh, like
Yeah.
very interesting of like tying that to a place and time. But I think Bridges does the part of looking a little bit older, disheveled kind of
Mhm.
situation. They were, I found this out, about the same age when they were filming that. Now, apparently Rooster Cogburn is supposed to be about 40, which back in that time probably 40 was like 60. But both Bridges and John Wayne were like late 50s. I think Bridges was like actually 60 whenever he was filming the thing, if I remember the data correctly.
Well, he looks, I mean, he does. He looks like
Yeah.
he's
Whereas like
got the
John
miles on
Wayne,
him.
John Wayne still like his coats and his wardrobe and
Hmm.
everything, like they're trying to make him look a little disheveled with like the eye patch and everything, but like
Yeah.
he's wearing that crystal clean brown kind of like you could go down to Northside, Texas, right? Down Northside Fort Worth, like down the street from me, and you would see people in Carhartts that look exactly like that jacket,
Exactly like that jacket.
right?
Um,
So it felt very much like an old Western movie that everyone knows is a movie. Whereas I feel like the newer one is like they're trying to immerse you in it. And I think they do a better job of it. But that one part of them being in the middle of it and seeing that person there, and then there's like the weird trapper and everything, like
mhm.
that part, now it only makes sense because of the plot device of having to break up with LaBeouf and everything, which doesn't
Right.
happen in the book and the original movie and everything. So
Yep.
that to me would be a very interesting conversation of like, how did you decide the thinking behind the choices with the pulls aways and the things you decided to keep the same? I think that would be a very interesting conversation.
All right. So we've resolved nothing
Nothing
here.
at all.
Nothing at all. And we are at the end of our time today. Um,
So, okay, I have
John.
some questions for you. Can I go
Okay, go
first?
ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Ask me some
I
questions.
know
Go
I
ahead.
just ruined your whole format. I'm
Yeah, it's
sorry. I
fine. It's
can't.
fine. The format is now blown
This
up.
is what makes me the best slash worst guest. If if you were going to sit a brand new leader down
Hmm.
and you tell them, hey, this is forced material. I need you to read the book. I need you to watch the movie. Or I need you to watch the newer movie.
Hmm.
Which one do you put that person on? And let's take away the idea that reading is a deeper comprehension level than just watching a movie, right? Just for how it does and tells the story. Which one do you think is the best place for a new leader to kind of sit in?
Honestly, I would probably have them watch the Cohen film.
Same.
Only because I think a new leader in the year we're in, context, right? I think they're going to resonate more with that perception of Mattie's moralism, the perception of having a plan A kind of fail and having to fall back to a plan B. I think they're going to resonate with the idea of um how do we assert moral authority and what does that actually look like. I think they're going to resonate a little bit more with the concepts of particularly if I tell them a little bit about Portis, not linking external success and fame to the work like we've been talking about.
Yes.
I also think that they're going to resonate with um Jeff Bridges as Rooster Cogburn, his bold actions there.
Yeah.
So the word grit is a word that Angela Duckworth made famous in
Oh
the
yeah.
business world,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a word that unfortunately, due to the passage of time, is now no longer referenced. And I think that's very interesting because right now, we need, and I would in particularly say to male leaders, particularly young male leaders, and by young, I mean 18 to 34. Young male leaders need a lot of grit right now. And I don't mean grit as in authoritarianism. I don't mean grit as in being abusive or being overweening. I don't mean any of that. Andrew Tate and Harvey Weinstein both share the same DNA. Not talking about that.
I love that. I'm with you.
Not talking about that. Okay.
I agree.
What I'm talking about is the grit to take on ownership and accountability for everything that is within your sphere of influence, and to do it in spite of the fact that the slings and arrows will come.
Yeah.
You're going to get that from understanding Charles Portis's life, understanding the book, and seeing the new movie kind of I think delivers that message a little bit better in a little bit better way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would hit him with the new movie first, and then I'd be like, yeah, you got to go read the book to get the whole idea here. But that's what I would do.
I agree. I think the second movie does a really good job of that juxtaposition of, you know, everyone thinks that they can just run around like Mattie and it's going to work, right? And that if it's not working, you need to go do something else. Whereas what I talk about people with is, you know, you can't force that on anyone, right? You have to meet them where they are. So I would pick the same movie just because I think most people need to understand that you're going to have hard days as a leader. You're going to have to go say some things that aren't popular. You're going to have to go let some people go that you potentially brought onto a team, right? And I think that second movie does a really good job of showing how you have to live with the actions, right? Past it. You know, you don't get to ride off on a horse and everything is okay and there's no lasting impact of it. You know, everything that made him great as far as like being the hero that she needed leads to all of his other struggles, right? And you have to, as a leader, you have to know that you're carrying both, right? The greatness that is you is also attached to the things that are going to drive some people nuts. And that's how it has to be. Yeah. Right. No one is just going to lay down for you all the time, and people shouldn't, right? They're supposed to push back. You're supposed to kind of have to give a reason and a thought behind why you're doing what you're doing. If we're not doing that, we are tyrants, right? We're just expecting people to run and jump and do certain things because we said so with no contextual reasoning why.
Well, and in the world that we live in today, and by the way, I'd like to thank John Hill for coming on the podcast today. We could have talked about this book for literally hours, and we just began to scrape the surface. So go pick up your own copy of True Grit by Charles Portis. Watch the Coen movie. Watch the Hal Wallace John Wayne film. Take a look at that one as well. And read up a little bit on Charles Portis and his life and the kinds of decisions that he made. There's a great scene at the end, and it's close to the end of the back end of the third act in the second film, and the back end of the third act in the first film, and in the book where John Wayne rides out against Ned Pepper, and Ned Pepper challenges him. And he says, you know, I love this line, you know, 4 against 1, right? You know, what's your intention? Do you think that 1 on 4 is a dogfall? And Rooster says, I mean to kill you in 1 minute, Ned, or see you hanged at Fort Smith at Judge Parker's convenience. Which will you have? Lucky Ned Pepper laughed. He said, I call that bold talk for a one-eyed fat man. And of course, Rooster said, fill your hand, you son of a bitch.
Yeah. Which, you know, he gave him some options.
He gave him options.
It was not like, as I tell everyone, as a consultant, your job is to give people options and then help them understand the weight of those options. But if you're running around as a coach or a consultant and people are like, they didn't listen to all my advice, welcome to the party. That's how it works, right?
That's right.
And honestly, that's your first learning lesson, that not everyone is going to hear it the way that it naturally comes out of your mouth. And you might need to put in some work and some effort into how it needs to come out of your mouth. So that way it can be heard regularly and consistently.
Well, and the 4 that you are fighting against, the dogfall you're fighting against in this world, is the algorithm, of course. It's social media. It's circumstances, but it's also other people. And look, we are supposed to engage with other people. I fundamentally believe that, in order to lead them. But we're also supposed to have accountability for those exact same people. We're supposed to have accountability for what they do and for what they don't do. A non-decision is still a decision.
And you're not even a sales guy.
And I'm not even a sales guy.
Like you're not even a sales guy saying that. Like I'm like, oh my gosh, are you allowed to say that? Like, ooh. But that's true.
I might have said it out loud. I might have said it out loud.
If they can't make a decision, that's a problem, right? And if you can't figure out that if someone is just not decisive enough to make a decision versus someone who wants them to give you the decision that you want, you're not even on the level. Like you're not ready to be a leader. You're not ready to be in sales. You're not ready to do anything else. And you're definitely not ready to get on your high horse on LinkedIn and go around talking about how people don't get it.
So less of that from everybody out there. And more of listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, because this podcast will help you figure out where the dogfall actually is. So once again, I'd like to thank my guest, John Hill, for coming on today. Look, connect with him as a consultant, connect with him on LinkedIn. We will have links to as usual, to all the places where you can get a hold of him. Go buy his book, go listen to his podcast, go hire him when you want to figure out how to be a better sales leader. And with that, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.